Sometimes you embark on a course not knowing the outcome, but you must always do what you know to be right, just, and fair. Desmond Allum. Born in 1934, Desmond Allum grew up in Fyzabad, which he says was truly an experience that held him in good stead and gave him a solid foundation.
Oh, growing up in Fyzabad was really the most idyllic experience because and it had to do particularly with the time during which I grew up in Trinidad.
He remembers when he was about 2 or 3 years old that the oil fields were burning. It was no doubt the Uriah Buzz Butler period in the nation's history.
I remember my mother holding me close to her bosom and my, sensing some fear and aware of a glow.
He says that period shaped his thinking because he always had a penchant for the labor movement, for justice and equality.
Because it was on the 19th of June 1937 when Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler called a strike in the oil fields, and they had set the oil fields afire. And I think that's how the glow came and all that. And I think that experience has, in a sense, kind of charted the whole course of my life because I've always been involved and interested in the working class, and so.
At an early age, he recognized racial differences, but more so the inequality of racism.
There was also a downside to growing up in Fyzabad in that time because Fyzabad was near center of the oil industry, which was dominated clearly by a lot of expatriate companies coming out of London and so. And it was an era in which virtually every white man was your boss, right? And no matter how incompetent they were.
Fourth in a family of 8 siblings, he states without hesitation that his mother, a seamstress, was the greatest influence in his life.
I mean, a lot of that is due to the fact that I had a very enlightened mother. She was, really, one of the greatest influences in my life because, as I say, she was very religious, but religious in a very practical way. She treated everybody equally.
From an early age, Desmond was nicknamed Principal by his peers. It was indeed one of his more prominent characteristics.
I ended up with the nickname Principal, and I'm saying that we had this cricket team. I was the captain, and I was very insistent on discipline. In order to get the team, you had to come and practice. And we had this particularly good player who didn't turn up for practice, and we had a very important game. And I said, I'm sorry, but you're not on the team. And all the members of the team were questioning, but how can you leave him out? How can you leave out? Sanderson was his name. He's one of the best players. I say, I'm sorry. As a matter of principle, I'm not going to pick him because he didn't turn up for practice. And they all began to laugh, Principal, Principal, and that nickname stuck for a while. But although I'm no longer called Principal, I really think it is a feature of my character that I rarely stand up on principle on so many matters.
Desmond comes from a time where principle was a very important thing in your professional life. He comes from a time where people in Trinidad and Tobago, and he comes from a place in Trinidad and Tobago where people, you were part of a community always.
Having won a government exhibition scholarship from Fyzabad Intermediate Primary School, Desmond entered St. Mary's College.
I was fortunate in the sense that I got a scholarship from the old field. So we lived in Fyzabad to come to school at St. Mary's College, right? Which sometimes gave people the impression that I was kind of set apart. In my generation, right? In order to be regarded as successful, one either had to be a doctor or a lawyer. It could be nothing else to be successful.
After having worked as a pharmacist, Desmond applied to Howard University in Washington, but was unable to come up with the $15,000 to secure a visa. He then turned his sights to England and departed for London in 1958.
In 1958 was the time they had the Notting Hill race riots, right? And in fact, the address to which I was going was in Notting Hill, where I had a cousin who had secured accommodation there for me. And I tell you that for the first year that I was in London, if I had a return ticket, I really would have come back. And all in all, I spent 7 years in London, and I wouldn't exchange those 7 years for any other 7 years in my life, because they were not always happy times. But though that period really was such a total preparation for life that, as I say, all in all, I won't exchange them for things. It was difficult because there was a lot of racism, sometimes practiced subtly, sometimes not so subtly. I mean, you were looking for a room, and you'll see on the notice board, no dogs, no blacks, no colored, no Irish, That was the thing, it needn't apply.
In January 1963, having already qualified as a lawyer in 1962 at Middle Temple, Desmond was working with the Inland Revenue Service when he and his friend George Hislop encountered a truly dark side of British law. Desmond had been representing West Indians whom the Metropolitan Police had framed with drugs, but he never expected to become a victim himself.
By that time in the community, West Indian, which was fairly close-knit, everybody knew that Desmond was a lawyer. So whenever they had problems, they would come to me and so. And this particular January night, prior to that, a number of friends from Trinidad and people I knew had been complaining that the police had been planting marijuana on a lot of them and making a lot of false cases and so. I was going to Tobago to give my sister some money, so both George and I decided to travel together on the underground. We left Finchley Road, where we had been looking at television with some friends. And as we were making our way to the underground station, we were accosted by these two men, long black coats and so forth. It was a winter night. And they then said that they wanted to question us. So I said, well, we have no objection to being questioned, as provided you identify yourselves as, police officers. They flashed some cards, which we didn't even have time to read, but I was satisfied with that. The officer then said, you're both under arrest. I said, arrest for what? He said, for attempting to steal a motor car. No, I knew that was so ridiculous because we hadn't stopped even near a car or anything. And George, he was a black belt in judo. He had done physical education at Roughborough. He began to lose his temper and became very irate. He said, what I want to steal a car for? I have my ticket to travel on the underground. So I said, George, take it easy. I said, don't you realize what's happening? Because I knew that we were now going to be the victims of the same kind of fabrication.
Once exonerated, Desmond Allum decided to sue the Metropolitan Police Department, a move that was not supported by the Trinidad and Tobago government, but which he no less pursued. The case commenced in May 1966. Life for Desmond Allum would have its trials because he took a stand, but it would also have its joys.
They had a jury of 12, and the jury in those days fixed both, they gave the verdict as well as fixed the quantum of damages. Now, I had researched every single case of malicious prosecution up to that point, and the highest award of damages that was made had been £750 to some English solicitor who some false charge had been made against. 2 weeks before the trial, the Metropolitan Police said they offered to settle the case. They wanted to give us £250. And our lawyers asked if we could accept that. I said no. I spent 3 years waiting on this case. If they give us £500, we would settle. Well, they refused to budge. When it came now to the judge summed up totally in our favor. We were certain we would win the case. So the jury retired, and they came out. They stayed out for about like 2 hours, and we were really getting worried. Why so long? So they came back, and they said the damages £4,000 each. Well, everybody was aghast, So
Having been awarded a total sum of £8,000, Desmond married Catherine 10 days later and soon after returned home. Catherine joined him later in 1966.
I got married within 10 days of that. I came home to Trinidad. My wife, Catherine, who is Irish, she came home at the end of the year. And, you know, the rest, as they say, is history. We've been married now some 43 years. She was and is the woman who was most like my mother. Generous, supportive of friends, you know, nothing of color or anything like that. So I think in that sense I've been very, very fortunate.
Desmond has 3 children and 3 grandsons. His son, who recently got married, now lives in Amsterdam, a daughter in Brazil, and another daughter in Trinidad. Desmond is an avid sports fan, and from early childhood days has nurtured a love for cricket and football. His newest passion is golf.
Sometimes you embark upon a certain course, you have no guarantee of how far, you know, it will go, but you have always to do what you feel to be right, because I don't think, you know, I would ever have been able to live with myself if I had not pursued this action, notwithstanding whatever the outcome was. I had to be satisfied that I did everything that I could towards achieving the end that I thought was just and fair.
Once back in Trinidad, he began practicing law in the chambers of Adrian Colarienzi in the south, but a few months later moved to Port of Spain and joined Theodore Guerra. Interestingly, Guerra and Carl Hudson Phillips were on the prosecuting team in the court-martial and treason case against Rafiq Shah, LaSalle, and Bazzi. Desmond was part of the defense team when Shah was eventually acquitted.
I remember particularly during the Black Power era, I represented a lot of the detainees. I represented Lieutenant Shah, who was one of the main protagonists.
In yet another high-profile case, Desmond was asked by the then Prime Minister, George Chambers, to be the lead investigator of the now famous Scott Drug Report, in which charges were laid against renowned crime fighter, the late Randolph Burroughs, then police commissioner.
The evidence that we uncovered showed that police had information that these fellows were staying at a place just off the Lady Young, and they were going to be leaving next morning. And Mr. Burroughs called together his squad and gave instruction that these persons were to be shot on sight.
When you consider, for example, Desmond's involvement in simple things like the Scott Drug Report, and Desmond had to deal directly with people like Cuthbert Charles, Cutty Charles as he was called, and his knowledge of what really pertained as the truth in the country in relation to drugs, he would have been in a position and he would not have been afraid to deal with those things. Not at all.
Sympathetic to the labor movement, he got involved with the United Labour Front, a collaboration between Rafiq Shah and Basdio Pandey. But after the ULF broke up, he was adrift. In 1986, when the National Alliance for Reconstruction won the general elections, he was a firm supporter. But soon after the NAR came into power, he felt its government started selling out Trinidad and Tobago. So in 1991, when he was approached by Patrick Manning to run under the People's National Movement's banner, he accepted. It was much touted that this was the new PNM, where corruption was a thing of the past.
The persons who had the greatest influence in persuading me to join the PNM was Dr. Keith Rowley and Augustus Ramrika Singh. And at that time, the PNM was portraying itself as the new PNM. They were turning their back on corruption and, you know, all the days of O'Halloran and so, under the leadership of a vibrant young man, you know, Manning and so. And in the end, I know that I was getting a little bit older, and I felt that if ever I had to make any kind of contribution, this was perhaps, you know, I thought maybe my last chance to do it. And I did think that the PNM was serious about, you know, going in a new direction.
Desmond ran for the St. Anne's West Port of Spain constituency in the 1991 elections and won. As a lawyer and senior counsel, Desmond was believed to be a perfect fit for the Attorney General's position, and well he thought he would aspire to such lofty heights. But it was not to be. Keith
Tobian
was appointed instead. Allum reflects in hindsight that it was probably for the good.
It was a shock to most people that he wasn't. In fact, I think most people voted for Desmond on the basis of who he was. And his projection as a person of integrity and as a person who is highly respected in the law, and at the same time highly regarded for his commitment to people, made him, I think, in the minds of many people, the natural person for the Attorney General position.
That position has become one that has lost its sense of integrity, and many people have come in and out of that position because it was never stabilized by someone of his level of integrity and commitment and loyalty to Trinidad and Tobago.
The Prime Minister offered him the portfolio of Minister of Labour, a post he admitted he was not qualified for. In principle, he subsequently declined the offer.
So when we won the election, I think it was a Monday night as far as I remember. And of course, as you know, under the Constitution, the cabinet can be constituted of two persons, the Prime Minister and the Attorney General. So that the first appointment that has to be made is the Attorney General. We went to Balize House, celebrations and so, and Mr. Manning studiously avoided me throughout that night. The next morning, it was announced that Keith Tobian was to be the Attorney General and so on. And my phone was ringing off the hook next day, how that could be done and this. So I, resigned myself to that. Later on, the Prime Minister offered me the Ministry of Labour, Minister of Housing, all of which I declined, telling him I had no competence in those areas. And I remember him telling me, you don't need any special competence. All you need is common sense and a level head. So I told him, I said, well, I didn't think that was enough, and I said, I respect your decision to appoint Keith Tobian if you think he's, a better person than I am. But it didn't take me longer than a week to realize that I could not be appointed Attorney General. And if I had been, that relationship between myself and the Prime Minister would have ended within 2 weeks.
Desmond tried with limited resources to help his constituents. But as he says, he was not part of the in crowd and was therefore not favored. He kept his ears to the ground, still walked about his constituency, meeting and talking to people.
So I suspect in his early days, he may not have found favor because politics, especially at that time, and even so today, is focused on carrying a line. And that will be very uncomfortable for someone from Desmond Allum, whom I have got to know.
There were two turning points and low periods in his political career. The first was the arrest of Oka Sepaul, then Speaker of the House, and the subsequent hanging of Glenn Ashby.
An execution could not be carried out unless the registrar was present. So there was the order of the court made for everybody, including the registrar, to be in court at 6:30. Thereby, feeling that once he was there, then they couldn't pursue him. Court was convened at 6:30. Everybody else was there. They looked around for the registrar, who was, at that time, the Chief Magistrate, Mr. McNichols. And he didn't turn up until, I think it was like 7:30. And when he was asked, why are you late? Why weren't you here? He said, well, I've just come from the prisons where Ashby has been executed. And I tell you, I've never felt, such a low moment and all that. And in particular, I remember when the state of emergency was declared in order to put Oka Sepaul under arrest, I was offended is an understatement. And that day I was determined to walk away.
Desmond Allum still maintains a door tenant at at the chambers of Len Woodley, Queen's Counsel in England, the same chambers where Nelson Mandela also has a door tenant. He is heavily committed to the Cotton Tree Foundation, a non-profit organization in the St. Anne's area that helps children, an effort he was first attracted to while still a member of Parliament.
I wasn't one of the most favored persons in the PNM because, so I got very little in the way of resources for my constituents, so that was very frustrating. And that is what led me to form the Cotton Tree Foundation, because it provided an avenue where we could, try to help the young people in the area, and we have some really very public-spirited people.
In his chambers at the offices of Trinity Law Chamber on Edward Street, he reveals he has recently joined the Congress of the People. He firmly believes this party is what the country now needs. If the both races would come together as one, we will have a beautiful country, he opines.
The society has become so unequal. You have, quite recently, people in the Beetham, they're drinking water out of a canal, in full view of people drinking champagne in the Hyatt. And that kind of thing, it really is so obscene with the misplaced order of priorities in this society. People have very little access to health care. Education is in a shambles. The police, well, the rising incidence of crime, and there's a continuing obscenity that is taking place.
That statement from Desmond doesn't surprise me. It's what I expect, because Desmond is quick to see the lot of the poor, because Desmond came from humble circumstances. Desmond knows what it is like to go through those things, and he's never forgotten it, and that's what has made him more committed to the country more than anything else.
Desmond Allum says he does not regret running under the PNM, and that it was all part of the process of his development.
I would like to see Trinidad on the path to the creation of a more equal society, a society that is moving towards an achievement of its full potential. There's no other country in the world of our size, blessed with the resources that we have, that have the potential virtually to be a virtual paradise for every single citizen. Now, one is not preaching a total equality where everybody will have, but there are certain minimum standards which are achievable for every single member of this society if our resources were properly managed.
Thank you for what you've done, I think. Thank you for what you've done. That's the best thing I could tell him.
Well, at this point, I would want to assure him that there is a great amount of admiration and respect for who he is as a person.
Desmond Allum, an outstanding parliamentary personality.